Well, thank you very much. This is a very unique experience for me. This is the first time I'm making a presentation to a community of gamers. Most of the time I presented to very boring old academics in primarily academic conferences, but I'm excited. What prompted us to move towards this direction is with a one fundamental observation: our education system sucks. It's extremely boring. I'm not sure how many of you had a great experience in school. I never had one until at a very late stage in my life when I went and did my graduate studies, and then it became fun. So play, what we recognize is play is essential for well-being, not just for academics. So I'm not talking about here of using games to improve our academic performances, because that takes us back into the old school of thought. It's primarily games as play, which is essential for human well-being. One of the scary things that's coming out from a lot of the observations, and I'll talk about WHO a little bit, but one of the things that they have done in 2015, there was a study that was released which says, and I'm sort of saying this is global, but for India itself, 25% of kids between the age of 13 to 15 have some depression problems, leading to suicidal instincts, primarily driven by the anxiety and the tensions that the education system creates. Just to give you a context, in India, and I was really shocked when I took up my post in India, you need to get a 99.9% pass rate to get into a university. It's like 99.9%. That's, so the anxiety, the buildup, you just don't have a life. The kids just don't have a life. So the whole idea here is to change that experience, but at the same time, develop both the what we call the intellectual intelligence, but more important, the emotional intelligence. We have the science actually to that. So what we know, and this just came out in a very interesting journal article in Nature, where they had kind of done brain imaging of gamers versus non-gamers, some longitudinal studies, so you have some time span over that. Gamers have stronger functional connectivity. FC stands for functional connectivity within the different parts of the brain, and I'll show you those connectivities that they saw in gamers' brains. So pretty much most of you. I'm assuming that all of you are gamers. Yes? Yes. Yeah. So that's, and I'm going to show you how your brain looks like. And this is basically coming from some of the work that the neuroscientists have done. I'm not a neuroscientist. I'm actually a boring economist by training, but got really fascinated to sort of see how the science of neurosciences has been really contributing towards the whole science of learning. Surprisingly, our education system is not based on science. I'm not sure where it evolved from, but I think it was just a demand by the Industrial Revolution to produce workers for the factories. And we are still in that same mode as of 200-300 years ago. So that's the kind of the brain's connectivities that we are talking about. One of the things that came out from this study is where exactly in which parts of the brains this connectivity is extremely strong. And we're talking about actual AVGs, I think they call it, action violent games. And what they find in these, what happens with people who play with these games is that it increases attention regulation, which makes sense because you really have to focus, otherwise you get shot and you lose your points. But it also increases the sensory motor coordination, your hands, eyes, and you gamers will know that this happens. And this is what they have found, and which parts of the brain that happens is that particular part, the insular cortex, is where that attention regulation and sensory motor skills get activated. So you see a lot of bright connections happening at that part of the brain. When we put gamers playing this kind of AVG games under functional MRI machines. Now, the other interesting thing is that another group of scientists have been working on gaming and sort of seeing how it has an impact on the emotional side of the brains. And what happens is that when people play games, huge amounts of dopamine and serotonin are injected into the brain structures. These are your feel-good chemicals. And so that actually has an important role in terms of stimulating that part of the brains. And you can sort of see a connection between what we call most of the limbic part. This is where the emotional dimensions are. This is where the connection between the emotional and the so-called cortex, where some of the intellectual stuff is happening. And this is your neocortex here. But with some of the games that are linked with emotional, these networks are starting to get activated. And you can see the amygdala, which is basically where anxiety, stress, and aggression starts merging from. We've also sort of found that it increased capabilities on the neocortex as well. But these are not games doing everything. These are particular games. So some genre of games create connectivity in some parts of the brains, but it doesn't do the whole structures. So this is where I'm kind of moving towards in terms of a demand from this community. And that's where the prefrontal cortex. So some games actually stimulate this quite a bit. Some do more and better than others. Other games trigger a lot of the insular cortex here, the attention regulation, which I had shown you. And then others create a lot more in the emotional dimensions. So what we have in the education system, and I'm going to talk to you about a little bit of a neural network that we want gamers to start, or game designers to start thinking about in terms of creating this particular neural network. And we've kind of coined a name for it, as a term for it. So this is our education system, one size fits all. So if you have a kid with dyslexia, and you have somebody who does not have they still have to have the same materials, the same way it's been imparted to them. Many of us suffer from that. You'll be interested to find out that 1 in every 5, that's the most pessimist. The most optimistic is 1 in every 10 of us have some form of difference learning. So I'm looking here, there are about maybe 35, 40. So 1 in 10, 4 to 8 of us here. I say us because I have some form of that, which was just recently diagnosed because I did the maybe positive, negative thing of employing a neuroscientist on my staff, who then sort of looked at me over some time and said, do you know that you have dyslexia after 54 years of my life? But it's a one-size-fits-all. This is the one that I really hate, the exogenous discrete assessments. You at the end of the semester, you go and sit for a 3-hour exam, and based on that 3 hours, your life is determined which way you move forward. Our whole life is defined with those examinations. It doesn't have to be that way. Failing is failure. That's one thing that the school system does really well. If you fail, you are a failure. Focus on building the intellectual intelligence. That's all it is all about, either through rote memorization or other forms, but it's all about the intellect. It's about the knowledge base, nothing else. Simulation of the neocortex at the most that we have found is static content and text-driven. Books. One of the things that I do when I have problems sleeping at night, I take my son's American constitutional history book. I'm off. Within 3 minutes, 4 minutes, I'm completely in slumberland. I don't need all those sleeping pills and all that chemical stuff to get me off. So it's, in one way, those textbooks do some really good work, but in terms of actually for the intellectual simulation, it doesn't do. So what do we need in education? Multinodal, so you can already see where this is coming within your sphere of expertise. Multinodal to fit different learning styles, video, audio, action, continuous motions. Dynamic in changing with feedback. A player plays a game, he has feedback, it's continuously changing. Interactive, immersive, reward-driven, and endogenous. Wouldn't it be great if you have, within the school system, where the kid is given a game, And when he plays his games, and as he grows up from the levels that you have, you're basically been assessed. And by the time you reach a certain level, you have done it, and go on to the next level. So you don't have your one-time exams, it's just continuous. If you don't do it, you get back, learn again, just like like what you do in games. So that's where we are moving towards. So the game's potential, it's multisensory. I'm talking to the guys who do this all on a daily basis. Interactive, immersive, player-paced, and the one that I'm really focused on, the endogenous assessment. Self-paced and failure is learning. Failure, it's about just continuously learning. So, what we need from games, the creation of new neural networks. I've already talked about certain neural networks that have been created, the neuroplasticity that's happening when you're playing with the games. We call it the Gandhi neural network. It's based on a neuroscientist from UC San Diego who coined the word Gandhi neurons based on the mirror neuron network that we have in our brains, which talks about empathy. Mirror neurons in the sense that you can empathize with the other person. And that part of the brain is activated and it's natural, but we need to train it as well. So a lot of these networks have to be trained. You have to train your brain. It just doesn't happen naturally. And that's what we are talking about. Lighting up this whole structure so that you get all the synapses and all these neural networks and those functional connectivities. And that's what we're looking for in game design. So the gamer's brain, I wanted to tell, when I earlier talked to you about the connectivity, that's the gamer's brain. That's your brain. Looking at all that additional connectivities that you see, these are the additional connectivities that they have observed in gamers' brains versus those who don't play games. Connectivity, neuroplasticity is good. Connectivity means learning happens. Neuroplasticity means learning happens. So I had to throw this market potential, and now on reflection after a day or two, there's a lot of focus on, in terms of the market, the business model. It is huge, because if you look at the publishing houses in textbooks, it's huge. The schools, each textbook is about $35 to $40. Some of them go to $100, $200. You're basically replacing books as the primary medium of education. And that's what we think games have the potential to achieve. So the challenges, there are challenges. What we find within UNESCO when we have been going out there, we are not a game development company. We don't intend to get into that business. We want to work with partners who are in that business, who know that much better, to help us develop these kind of games. But right now, those games are very limited. Some are good. Many are also not so good. I'm not going to use the word bad, not so good, okay? Based on the pedagogical strengths. Does it actually stimulate learning? Quality assurance. Many of the companies that we have been working together, including Unity, Ubisoft, Microsoft, is that they kind of sort of are encouraging for some system of quality assurance, some kind of system which sort of says pedagogically it's been pretty good. It's been pretty good in building emotional intelligence. It's been pretty good at intellectual, or maybe not so good at emotional. That's okay, but you have that checklist. And they've been asking for that kind of system designed by the experts. Then this problem with the WHO report that came up with saying games have this problem of addiction. There was a big lashback on that, primarily from the psychology community. Of course, the gaming community wrote some responses, but you would expect them to sort of say that it doesn't. But the scientific community also came back to sort of say there isn't any real evidence to show that this happens. And the data that was used has some issues with it. And recently, I think it's just about 3 days to 4 days back, was a seminal paper that was published, which kind of alerted us that much of the data that has been used to show that on-screen time is bad for children, addictions, that data set has been erroneously used. And they showed how, and so there's a big rethink about that whole issue. So that's good news. But saying that the science is still not, as a good academic, I'll sort of say, we need to do still more research. But we need that data. We need a systematic approach in terms of how to collect that data and to analyze that. And then the myth of games and violence. There's been always this, the minute there's a random shooting in the school, hey, that kid played violent games. And that's the causality. That's also has not been established statistically. So this is the ask that I've come here. Quality games. I've been around, walking around, looking at all the different stalls, fantastic games, but I haven't seen the link with the educational component. Very few. And I'm sort of saying, kind of making it clear that this is a great place to put your talents, your creativity skills in developing those kind of games. Profits, yes, but they're not bottom line. I come from UNESCO, so we have a business model which really sucks because we don't make money. We continuously ask money from others. But we do understand that the developing community, the game developing community has to. So and publishing, textbook publishing companies make millions anyway. So I think it's a great potential for gaming, for the gaming community. And in supporting guidelines initiatives by UNESCO, we have this yearly conference in India. Last year, we invited a number of countries, which, when I say countries, which means Ministry of Education. One of the things that they requested and asked for UNESCO, this is what we do, is to develop this set of guidelines. If it goes through the process and if these guidelines get endorsed, then 193 member countries endorse this. And once you get the endorsement, if the game's endorsed, it's a big market out there, potentially big market. The gift from us is that the guidelines adopted by 193, access to schools. One of the things that we have, we are in the process of signing an agreement with one of the states in Andhra Pradesh now. A state in India is as big, in terms of population, is as big as some of the countries even combined in Europe. So it's a huge potential market out there. And one of the things is that they have agreed to allow us to bring in the games which have been developed, not by us, but by our partners, which have these guidelines as that provides those guidelines to access to their schools. An online learning platform. Surprise, surprise, UNESCO MGIEP is actually, we had spent the last 3 years developing an online platform because we felt the ones that were available were not according to the kind of outcomes that we wanted. So the focus was more in terms of getting the kids. It was more like a learning management system, looking at the kids, looking at the grades and monitoring it. Whereas the platform that we wanted was to actually stimulate learning, where teachers can come and create the content. It's got some rudimentary artificial intelligence in helping in terms of interventions, but with our focus on building what we call the balanced human being, emotional and intellectual. For us, from MGIEP's perspective, we really focus on the emotional intelligence. And what we have managed to get from that state government is to invest a relatively huge amounts of resources, as well in terms of both land, infrastructure, and financial resources to set up a hub, a whole ecosystem, where they have the science of learning, which means the research, incubators, new startups, teacher training academies, because if you don't train the teachers to use games, they're just going to be pushed back on it. We've already started on that particular very difficult community. But it's a whole ecosystem that kind of is connected. And like with every other ecosystem, economic incentives and all those different options are available for young startups to relocate. It's a great place. One of the reasons that I personally decided to go to this was it has one of the best beaches that I've seen around the world. Good weather around the world, all year round. And the land that has been provided for this hub is right there facing the ocean. So, and we have this conference every year. It's called TECH. It's a play of words, tech, technology, but it's actually Transforming Education Conference for Humanity. We've had two. It happens in December of every year. So it's a great time to escape the winters and come down south. We have quite a large number of speakers from around the world. The last one we had, the first year we had too many. We were hoping to get 800 and we ended up with 1,007. It was just a little bit too big. It was just too fragmented. So last year we focused a bit. We still had about 1,002. This year, I think we really want to focus a little bit more, but go in deep rather than go shallow. And we get it's a great place to meet a whole different sets of people. So who you'll get to meet is not just other gamers. You get to meet neuroscientists, development psychologists, teachers, policymakers. Yes, they're boring, but very useful to have around the table. We normally have a high-level policy forum where we bring in ministers from countries and tell them what's happening and stuff. So that the result from the last meeting was this guidelines, which they have requested from UNESCO. So it's kind of an exciting place, but it's not like that one community, but it's actually you'll meet a lot of new people. It's exciting to create new teams. And one of the things that we are looking for is game designers to hook up with neuroscientists who have done work on how the brain works, development psychologists, because of the different age groups. It's extremely important to target how the brain's development and which type of games would be useful and critical and gets the best return on investments. You get that kind of expertise supporting you in terms of the design. But they have no clue about game design. So we need that group as well. So in the last meeting, we had about, out of the speakers, we had about, I think about 10 to 15 game designers who actually talked about games, and teachers who have gone from the classroom, who are now designing games and set up their own companies. We have a strong group from Quebec, gaming community. What else? Yeah. So I hope to see you in tech, and we are always on the lookout for great speakers, great ideas, but the focus is on education and learning. Thank you very much. I'm not sure if we have questions, Q&As. No? Yes. So the guidelines are primarily, so what UNESCO does, one of its mandates is to produce guidelines across different, so one of the things that we were wondering is, like, for a game, what would be the pedagogical strengths of it? Age appropriateness, what's the time duration? So how much of cooperation does it build? How much collaboration, competitiveness, all the different variables, but we are hoping for a group of experts to come and tell us what that would be. And those guidelines would be basically some kind of a certification system, but it's primarily only for games that are targeting towards the educational sector. So not every game needs to have this, to follow these guidelines. If you're just making purely for entertainment, that's fine. But what we think would be, what it would offer, would be that if, and we will be doing that on our part, is to convince ministries of education around the world that games offer a really strong new pedagogical tool for learning, and we have the science to prove that. And so they start embracing that, and then we will have this whole suite of different games for different for different courses, for different disciplines, but following these broad guidelines. No questions?
We have a bit more time left if anyone
Anything about,
wants to
you want
ask.
to know anything more, a little bit about your brains? Yeah.
What is the best example of games being properly used in this context? Do you have like a game where you say like, okay, this is an example?
So the one that is really becoming very popular is Minecraft by Microsoft. Well, it wasn't by Microsoft, it was a company which has been bought over. So teachers have been using Minecraft quite a bit in terms of gaming. We use Hall of Heroes, is that right? Which is a great assessment a game for assessing socio-emotional skills. So one of the problems with socio-emotional, so that's the emotional intelligence, is that a lot of times when we want to assess it, you give questionnaires to the kids. But you know, kids are very smart. They know exactly what they need to say. Do you bully somebody who's weak? Of course you're going to say no, and you'll get all the right answers. But what this group have done is they have developed a game called Hall of Heroes, and that's for the older group. Then there's another game which is something called Zoo, which is for the younger kids, but still using the game to assess how strong their socio-emotional skills are. But there are not many that are available. What we are thinking of is if you would develop one on mathematics. So there's also a distinction which I found a little bit interesting where they say we have serious games versus fun games. And I thought serious games was always an oxymoronic term because I thought games were always supposed to be fun. So it becomes a serious. But when you take to a kid and say it's a serious learning game, they kind of tend to get put off. Another perfect example was Ubisoft's Assassin's Creed. They had developed Discovery, I think more as a learning game, but it was not really a game. It was more like just going and exploring things, and kids very quickly were turned off because they wanted the game. And so they came up with a lot of good suggestions that we hope to share with Ubisoft very soon on how the kids thought that using the main game itself, you could actually provide a lot of learning within that game. So it's still very early days. What we are thinking of, so we had a gaming challenge a couple of years ago. We sort of said first prize $100,000 to develop a game. And a team from Hungary got the competition, but what we found was the first prototype completely had problems with gender discrimination, racial issues, but it wasn't intentional. They never realized it. Then we had to spend a whole 1 year bringing together pedagogies, people from the education, and then over a year we worked on the game, and then we released it. It's called World Rescue, and is based on the, how many of you have heard of the UN's Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs? Oh, great. This is more hands than I get at a policy workshop, so that's great. So it focuses on 3 or 4 of the SDGs in those games. But it was a very simple, rudimentary game. It was our first, getting our feet wet. We've learned a lot. But one thing that we have come to terms is that we need this community to be engaged rather than we build games ourselves. We just can't do it. And developing a curriculum around a game is not simple. It's so easy to just teach mathematics the way it has been done. But if you want to teach it through a game, you need to have a script, you need characters, you get to get the kid interested, and then at the same time impose learning outcomes at each level. So when you get through the first level, you must have achieved at least 2 or 3 of these learning outcomes that we want you to achieve. Then you go to the next level so that we know that we can show to and demonstrate to the policymakers that the kid is learning and that the learning outcomes have been achieved. And the game actually has these built into it. Not easy. We've been struggling, to tell you the truth.